The air was heavier than usual, the kind of sticky weight that made each breath feel labored. I wasn't planning on running today, but a creeping restlessness had taken hold of me since the afternoon. It felt like something unseen was pressing at the edges of my consciousness, urging me to move, to go somewhere, anywhere. So I laced up my shoes, stepped out onto the cracked asphalt of the cul-de-sac, and started jogging. The route I usually took through the neighborhood felt stale tonight. I'd run it 100 times, past the same rows of sleepy houses and parked cars, under streetlights that flickered inconsistently like they couldn't decide whether to give up entirely. I turned left when I normally turned right, taking a side road I'd rarely given much thought to before. It was quiet, too quiet, even for this late hour. The houses thinned out quickly, replaced by skeletal trees that leaned into the road as if eavesdropping on whoever passed by. Soon the pavement turned uneven, with weeds sprouting in the cracks. It felt wrong to keep going, but I couldn't seem to turn back. My legs propelled me forward as though they had a will of their own. After a mile or so, the road ended abruptly, giving way to a wide dirt path flanked by rusted metal fencing. A faded sign hung crookedly from one post, its words long worn away by time and weather. I slowed to a walk, curiosity getting the better of me. There was no logical reason to continue, but something about the path drew me in. It felt like the place had been waiting for someone to notice it again. The dirt path led me further from the world I recognized. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching overhead to form a tangled canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air smelled damp, earthy, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My shoes kicked up small clouds of dust, and the sound of my footsteps was the only noise in the suffocating silence. Then I saw it. The tunnel. It emerged from the darkness like a yawning mouth, its opening framed by crumbling concrete and an archway lined with graffiti. Words and symbols I didn't recognize were scrawled in jagged, angry lines, some of them overlapping as though someone had tried to erase or overwrite them. The tunnel stretched into the earth at a steep angle, its interior disappearing into blackness. For a moment I just stared. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but something about the tunnel seemed to pull at me, like it had some kind of gravitational force. My breathing quickened, my pulse hammering in my ears. I stepped closer, peering into the void. There was no sound, no light, just an oppressive darkness that seemed to absorb everything around it. I hesitated at the threshold, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. Then I took a step inside. The air changed immediately, growing colder and thicker, as if the tunnel had its own atmosphere. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a weak beam of light ahead. The walls were slick with moisture, glistening faintly as I moved deeper inside. Water dripped from somewhere, the faint plinks echoing off the stone. The ground was uneven, a mix of dirt and scattered debris, broken glass, fragments of wood, and what looked like scraps of fabric, faded and rotting. About 20 feet in, the tunnel widened into a larger chamber, and that's when I saw them keys. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, hanging from the ceiling by thin strings. They swayed gently, as though moved by a breeze I couldn't feel. My flashlight reflected off their surfaces, creating a kaleidoscope of glinting metal. Each key was attached to a small paper tag, and as I stepped closer, I saw that the tags had names written on them in neat, blocky letters. The sight was bizarre, mesmerizing, and deeply unsettling. I walked slowly among the keys, holding my breath as I examined the names. Some were common: Michael, Sarah, Emily, while others were strange, foreign, or archaic. A few tags had been worn blank, their ink faded into illegibility. The sheer number of keys was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that each one had a story, a weight, a significance. Then I saw it. My name. My breath hitched, my chest tightening as if a fist had closed around my lungs. There it was, hanging among all the others, a plain silver key with a worn paper tag that read my name in bold, black ink. My mouth went dry, and I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling as I touched the tag. It felt brittle, like it might crumble under my fingers. Before I could pull my hand away, I heard it. Footsteps. Faint at first, like they were coming from somewhere deep within the tunnel, but growing louder with each passing second. They weren't the steady, measured steps of someone walking, they were faster, uneven, like someone running but struggling to keep their balance. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound echoed around me, impossible to pinpoint. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dart and lurch like living things. The footsteps were getting closer now, and with them came a strange sound, like whispers layered over one another, too quiet to make out the words but insistent, pressing against my ears like a swarm of insects. I turned in a slow circle, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the endless rows of keys in the oppressive dark. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the whispers and the footsteps, and I realized I had to move. Whatever was coming, I didn't want to meet it. Clutching my phone tightly, I stumbled deeper into the tunnel, the beam of light shaking wildly as I tried to steady my hands. The keys clinked softly overhead, their strings swaying as though disturbed by my passing. The air grew colder with every step, biting at my skin and stinging my eyes. The whispers didn't fade, though they only grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was making them was right behind me. And then I heard it again. Louder this time, footsteps. Not behind me, but ahead. The footsteps ahead were heavy, purposeful, each one echoing through the tunnel like a warning shot. My body locked up, my instincts warring between fight and flight. I hadn't seen anyone down here, hadn't seen anything that should have made those noises, but now, it felt like the darkness was alive, watching, waiting. The beam of my flashlight darted ahead, trembling as it caught the uneven walls and scattered debris. And then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was subtle at first, a flicker of motion, like a shadow shifting where no shadow should exist. My breath caught, my legs screaming for action, but my brain couldn't decide which way to go, toward the footsteps or away from them, deeper into the unknown or back toward the entrance that now felt impossibly far away. The whispers had grown louder, an almost rhythmic chant that vibrated in my skull, sending sharp jolts of panic down my spine. My own name slipped through the murmurs, unmistakable and chilling. "Run," I whispered to myself, and my legs obeyed. I bolted forward, the flashlight's beam careening wildly as I ran deeper into the tunnel, away from the approaching footsteps. The keys swayed violently as I passed beneath them, their metallic clinking rising to a fever pitch that nearly drowned out the sound of my pounding heart. I couldn't shake the sensation that the footsteps behind me had multiplied, like dozens of unseen figures were now giving chase. The tunnel twisted and turned, disorienting me further. Every time I thought I'd reached a dead end, the path would open up again, revealing yet another stretch of hanging keys. I couldn't make sense of it. There was no way a place like this should exist, hidden under the town I'd lived in for years. The cold air was like knives against my skin now, and the metallic scent had grown stronger, sharp enough to sting my nostrils. Ahead of me, the tunnel opened up again into another chamber, this one larger than the first. The ceiling was higher, and the keys here were sparser, hanging from longer, thicker strings that made them look like marionettes suspended in the dark. But it wasn't the keys that caught my attention, it was the walls. They were covered in names. Thousands of them scrawled in uneven handwriting, etched into the damp stone. Some were crossed out, jagged lines slashing through the letters, while others had been underlined or circled, as if to highlight their importance. I shone the flashlight across the wall, my pulse hammering in my ears as I scanned the endless rows of names. And then I saw it again, my name. This time it wasn't just on one key. It was written over and over, carved into the stone with varying degrees of precision. Some renditions were shaky, as if done in haste, while others were painstakingly neat, almost reverent. My knees threatened to give out, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me like an anchor. Behind me, the footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint clinking of the keys swaying overhead. I turned slowly, every nerve screaming at me to keep moving, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness behind me. My flashlight barely illuminated the corridor I'd just come from, its beam flickering as if struggling against an unseen force. And then I saw them eyes. Dozens of them, glinting faintly in the dim light. They didn't blink, didn't waver, just stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the shapes behind them, but the air seemed to shift, growing heavier as if the space itself was closing in around me. "Who's there?" My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The eyes didn't respond. Instead, the footsteps resumed, this time softer, slower, like whatever was out there was taking its time. I backed away, stumbling over loose stones and debris as I kept my flashlight trained on the eyes. They followed me, unblinking, the shadows around them shifting and contorting in ways that made my stomach churn. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning as I pushed myself further into the labyrinth of the tunnel. The air grew colder still, each breath searing my throat as I gasped for oxygen. The keys became fewer, the spaces between them widening until they disappeared altogether. The whispers never stopped, though they grew louder, more insistent, and I could swear they were trying to form words now. My name was repeated again and again, distorted but unmistakable. The tunnel narrowed suddenly, the walls closing in until I was forced to slow down and squeeze through a jagged gap in the stone. The flashlight slipped from my hand as I pushed through, landing with a clatter on the other side. I grabbed it quickly, sweeping the beam across my new surroundings. This chamber was different. The walls were smooth, polished, almost reflective, and the air was unnaturally still. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface cracked and stained. Resting on it was a single key, larger than the others I'd seen, its surface blackened and pitted as though it had been burned. A tag dangled from it, fluttering slightly despite the absence of any breeze. I didn't want to approach it, but my legs carried me forward anyway, as if something unseen was pulling me toward it. The tag bore my name again, written in the same blocky handwriting as before. My hand trembled as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, crushing, as though the entire tunnel system was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me began to shake. The polished walls cracked and splintered, shards of stone raining down as a deep, guttural roar echoed from somewhere far below. The key in my hand burned like ice, and I dropped it instinctively, stumbling backward as the pedestal crumbled into dust. From the cracks in the floor, something began to emerge. It wasn't human, not even close, but its shape was wrong, twisting and shifting as though it couldn't decide what form to take. The thing rising from the cracks was impossible to describe fully. It shifted as I stared, its form flickering between shapes and textures, like smoke trying to mold itself into something solid. At moments it seemed humanoid, limbs stretching unnaturally long before dissolving into writhing tendrils. At others it was a mass of twisting darkness, pulsing with an unnatural light that hurt to look at. A low, resonant sound, almost like a growl but too deep and layered to belong to anything living, filled the chamber. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand frozen, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as though the thing's very presence rooted me in place, an unseen weight pressing down on me, pinning me to the ground. My chest tightened as panic clawed its way up my throat, but all I could do was watch as the entity dragged itself fully into the room. The air around it seemed wrong, shimmering like heat waves on asphalt, even though the temperature was frigid. The whispers returned, louder now, as though they were pouring directly into my ears. They weren't just saying my name anymore, they were speaking in fragmented phrases, overlapping and garbled, but somehow I understood them. You brought this. It was always yours. The key. You took it. My gaze darted to the blackened key, still lying on the ground where I'd dropped it. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, and the thing in the cracks surged forward, a tendril of darkness lashing out toward the key. Instinct kicked in, and I lunged for it, snatching it up just before the tendril could reach it. The moment my fingers closed around the cold metal, the room shuddered violently, and the entity recoiled, its form flickering more rapidly, as if in pain. The whispers turned into a cacophony of shrieks, the sound sharp and piercing like broken glass grinding together. I stumbled backward, clutching the key tightly, and felt the jagged wall behind me. The thing shifted again, pulling itself taller, its amorphous body blocking the way I'd come. There was no way out, no escape. But then I saw a faint outline etched into the far wall. It was a keyhole. The realization hit me like a slap. The key wasn't just some random object, it had a purpose, a destination. My heart raced as I scrambled toward the wall, the thing behind me surging forward with a guttural roar. The ground trembled violently, cracks snaking toward me as I reached the keyhole. I jammed the key in, my hand shaking so badly I fumbled twice before it slid into place. The key turned smoothly, almost too easily, and the moment it clicked into place, the roar stopped. The air stilled, the tremors ceased, and for one brief, terrifying moment, everything was silent. Then the wall dissolved, I don't mean it crumbled or broke apart, it simply vanished, like smoke dissipating in the wind. Beyond it was another tunnel, this one faintly illuminated by an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to come from nowhere. It was narrow, the walls slick and glistening, and the air carried the same metallic tang I'd smelled earlier, only stronger now, almost overwhelming. I hesitated, glancing back at the chamber. The thing was still there, its form writhing as if in agony, but it didn't follow me. It couldn't, I realized. The key, the door, whatever I'd just done had stopped it, at least temporarily. Without giving myself time to think, I stepped into the new tunnel, my legs shaking with every step. The light grew brighter as I moved forward, pulsing like a heartbeat. The walls seemed to close in around me, narrowing until I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, less chaotic, as though they were guiding me instead of tormenting me. My name came through clearly, repeated again and again, accompanied by other words I couldn't fully make out. The tunnel opened up abruptly into another chamber, smaller than the last but even stranger. The floor was covered in a shallow pool of water, its surface perfectly still, despite the faint rippling light that danced across it. Hanging from the ceiling were more keys, but these were different. They weren't made of metal, they looked organic, like bone or ivory, and they swayed gently despite the absence of any breeze. In the center of the room was a pedestal, almost identical to the one I'd seen before, but this one was intact, its surface smooth and polished. On it rested another key, this one gleaming as though freshly forged. Its tag was blank, the paper pristine and unmarked. I approached cautiously, my footsteps splashing softly in the water. The whispers grew louder as I neared the pedestal, urging me forward, but with them came a new sound, faint, distant footsteps. They were uneven, dragging, as though whoever or whatever was making them was injured or struggling to move. I grabbed the key from the pedestal, and the footsteps stopped. The room darkened instantly, the pulsing light extinguished as though someone had flipped a switch. I was plunged into total darkness, the silence so complete it felt deafening. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on the flashlight, but the moment I pressed the button, the beam illuminated something standing directly in front of me. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by a featureless mask. It didn't move, didn't react, but its presence was suffocating, the air around it heavy with a palpable wrongness. In its hand, it held a key identical to the one I'd just taken, the blank tag dangling from its fingers. The whispers came back, louder than ever, drowning out every coherent thought. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it took a single step forward. The figure's movement was deliberate, unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. My feet refused to cooperate as I stared at it, rooted in place by the sheer force of its presence. My flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness around us. The whispers weren't just in my ears anymore, they were in my head, their overlapping voices clawing at the edges of my sanity. The figure took another step. The shallow water rippled around its feet, though I couldn't see its legs or any part of its body beyond the pale, featureless mask and the skeletal hand clutching the key. The air between us seemed to ripple like heat waves, distorting the space and making it difficult to tell how far away it actually was. My instincts screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The key in my hand grew cold, so cold it burned. I hissed in pain and nearly dropped it, but the moment my grip loosened, the whispers sharpened into a single, commanding voice. "Don't let go." The words pierced through the cacophony, clear and undeniable. My fingers tightened around the key, despite the searing cold, and as I did, the figure stopped moving. It tilted its head again, the gesture almost curious, and then it slowly raised its free hand. The motion was deliberate, calculated, and as its hand rose, so did the water around us. The still surface broke apart in violent ripples, rising unnaturally, as though pulled upward by invisible strings. The water twisted and coiled into shapes, arms, hands, faces, all of them reaching toward me with impossible speed. I stumbled backward, splashing wildly as I tried to avoid the grasping forms. One hand grazed my arm, and the chill that followed was paralyzing, spreading through my muscles like frostbite. The figure didn't move, but the water surged toward me again, the ghostly limbs clawing and grasping. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching the distorted faces forming in the water. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths frozen in silent screams, and the sight of them sent a jolt of raw terror through me. I ran. The chamber was smaller than I'd realized, but there was an opening at the far end, another tunnel, barely visible in the dim light. I sprinted toward it, the water splashing around my ankles as the ghostly forms pursued me. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent, pleading. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning. I had to keep moving. The moment I crossed into the tunnel, the water stopped. The sound of splashing faded abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that was almost worse. I glanced back and saw the figure standing at the edge of the chamber, its mask tilted as if watching me. The ghostly forms in the water dissolved, sinking back into the shallow pool, and the figure lowered its hand. For a moment I thought it would stay there, trapped in the chamber like the entity I'd left behind earlier, but then it began to follow, stepping slowly into the tunnel. My breath hitched, and I turned back toward the darkness ahead, my legs trembling as I forced them to move. The tunnel was narrower than before, its walls pressing in tightly enough that I had to duck and squeeze past jagged protrusions of stone. The whispers faded to a faint murmur, replaced by the distant sound of rushing water. The air grew damper, heavier, as though I were descending deeper into the earth. The key in my hand grew heavier with every step, its cold weight pulling at my arm. I didn't dare drop it, though not after what had happened when I'd almost let go. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and branching in ways that made no sense. I didn't know how I was navigating it. I just kept moving, driven by an instinct I didn't fully understand. Then I saw it. A faint light ahead, flickering like a dying flame. I stumbled toward it, my chest heaving with exhaustion and fear. The tunnel opened into another chamber, and this one was unlike anything I'd seen before. The walls were covered in mirrors, each one cracked and tarnished but still reflecting the faint light that emanated from the center of the room. The light came from a single lantern, its flame impossibly bright despite the glass being shattered. Around the lantern were more keys, hundreds of them arranged in a circle on the floor. Each one had a tag, and each tag bore a name. In the mirrors, my reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The reflections moved slightly out of sync, their expressions distorted in ways that made my stomach churn. Some smiled when I wasn't smiling, others stared blankly as though they didn't recognize me. And in the mirror directly opposite me, the figure appeared, standing motionless, its mask reflecting the light of the lantern. My legs wobbled as I stepped into the room, the weight of the key in my hand almost unbearable now. The whispers returned, softer this time, and I realized they were coming from the mirrors. Each reflection whispered something different, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and desperation. At the center of the room, just beyond the circle of keys, was another pedestal. This one was taller, more ornate, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them. On the pedestal was a lock ancient and rusted, its edges worn smooth. It was waiting for the key in my hand. I stepped toward it, the reflections in the mirrors watching my every move. The figure didn't follow me into the room, it stayed in the mirror, its mask tilting slightly as I approached the pedestal. My hand shook as I raised the key, the cold metal biting into my skin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though begging me to stop, but I couldn't. Something deep inside me knew that this was the only way forward, the only way to end whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. The key slid into the lock with a sickening click. The moment the key clicked into place, a sound erupted from the lock, a deep, resonant groan that reverberated through the chamber like the tolling of a massive bell. It vibrated in my chest, my skull, even in my teeth, making the air itself feel as if it were tearing apart. The reflections in the mirrors reacted instantly. They began to distort violently, their faces stretching and twisting in grotesque ways, as if they were trying to escape the confines of the glass. The figure in the mirror tilted its head once more, but this time it moved closer, not physically, but through the reflection, stepping toward the glass as though it were no more substantial than smoke. I staggered back from the pedestal, my pulse roaring in my ears. The key in the lock began to turn on its own, grinding against the ancient mechanisms inside, releasing a sound like snapping bones. As the key completed its turn, the lantern at the center of the room flared to life, its broken glass melting away as the flame burned brighter than anything I'd ever seen. I had to shield my eyes, my skin prickling as the room filled with an unnatural heat. When I lowered my arm, I saw that the keys on the floor were no longer still. They rattled violently, spinning and scraping against the stone as though some unseen force were pulling at them. Then, one by one, they began to rise. The keys floated upward, their tags fluttering like dead leaves in a storm. They hovered in the air, aligning themselves into a circle above the pedestal, their metallic surfaces glowing with the same unnatural light as the lantern. The reflections in the mirrors grew more frantic, their mouths opening wide in silent screams as they pressed their hands against the glass, their faces splitting and reforming as though they were breaking apart from the inside. The figure in the mirror stepped forward again, and this time the glass cracked. Thin spiderweb fractures spread outward from its feet, racing across the surface of the mirror in every direction. I backed away instinctively, my flashlight clattering to the ground as my trembling hands failed to hold onto it. The figure raised its hand, pressing its palm against the cracking glass. The whispers that had filled the room rose to a deafening crescendo, and the glass shattered. The sound was unbearable, a high-pitched keening that drove me to my knees. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. Shards of mirror rained down around me, disappearing into the floor like drops of water hitting a still surface. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its mask glowing faintly in the lantern light, and began to walk toward me. Behind it, the other mirrors broke one by one, each releasing its own distorted reflection of me. They poured out of the shards like smoke, their bodies flickering and insubstantial. But their eyes, those hollow, burning eyes, were real. They moved with terrifying purpose, surrounding the room as though forming a barrier, trapping me with the masked figure. I scrambled to my feet, my back pressing against the far wall as the figure stopped just feet away from me. It tilted its head again, and for the first time it spoke. The voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room, resonating deep inside my chest like a second heartbeat. "You opened the door. Now you must take your place." My place. The words made no sense, but there was no time to question them. The figure raised its hand, pointing at the circle of keys still floating above the pedestal. The light from the lantern flickered wildly, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The keys began to spin, faster and faster, their tags tearing free and disintegrating into ash. The circle of light they created grew blinding, and I had to shield my eyes again. The heat from the lantern intensified, and I felt my skin begin to blister, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Something shifted behind me, and I turned just in time to see one of the reflections, the one that had been smiling when I wasn't. He lunging toward me. Its hands passed through my chest like smoke, and I felt a searing pain explode in my heart, as though something were being ripped out of me. I collapsed to the ground, gasping, as more reflections surrounded me. They reached for me, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. The masked figure stepped closer, its presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. My vision blurred, my consciousness slipping as the whispers became a single, deafening roar. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the lantern went out. The darkness was absolute. There was no sound, no light, no sense of direction, only the sensation of falling, as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. My mind reeled, and I felt myself being pulled downward, deeper and deeper into the void. When the light returned, I wasn't in the chamber anymore. I was standing in a vast, empty field, the sky above me a swirling mass of black and red clouds. The ground was covered in ash, and the air was thick with the metallic tang I'd smelled in the tunnel. In the distance I saw a figure standing alone, its silhouette stark against the roiling sky. It wasn't the masked figure. It was me. The version of me in the distance raised its hand, pointing towards something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart sinking as I saw what it was indicating. Another tunnel, another entrance, identical to the one I'd found on the edge of town. Its dark maw beckoned, the same oppressive pull I'd felt before gripping me once again. I realized, with a sinking dread, that I hadn't escaped. I'd simply entered another layer of whatever this was, another level of the nightmare. The key in my hand was gone, replaced by a new one, larger, heavier, and colder than the first. Its tag was blank, but I knew what it meant. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The whispers swirled around me, weaving through the ash-laden air like threads of smoke. They weren't just outside me anymore, they were inside my mind, invading every corner of my thoughts. My grip on the new key tightened instinctively, the cold metal biting into my palm. I didn't want to step closer to the tunnel, but my legs moved of their own accord, carrying me toward its gaping entrance. The version of me in the distance, the one that had pointed the way, didn't follow. It stood perfectly still, its posture unnervingly rigid. As I passed it, I couldn't help but glance back. Its eyes were fixed on me, empty and unreadable, and its mouth moved as if it were trying to speak. No sound came out, but I didn't need to hear it to understand. Its lips formed the same word over and over, slow and deliberate. Run. But I couldn't. My body wouldn't allow it. The pull of the tunnel was irresistible, like a tide dragging me toward an inevitable plunge. The closer I got, the more the whispers changed. They grew less chaotic, forming fragmented phrases that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Some were in my own voice, others sounded like distant echoes of people I knew, long-forgotten memories dredged up from the depths of my mind. This is where it ends. This is where it begins. You always come back. I reached the entrance, the tunnel looming over me like a predator waiting to strike. The air inside was colder than the void I'd fallen through, and the darkness was so complete it felt alive. For a moment, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the edge, the new key clenched tightly in my fingers, and I tried to fight the pull. I tried to turn back. But behind me, the ash-filled field was gone. In its place was the chamber of mirrors, the shattered glass glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The masked figure stood in the center, surrounded by the distorted reflections that had spilled out of the mirrors. They were all watching me, their hollow eyes unblinking, their hands outstretched as if reaching for me. There was no escape. I stepped into the tunnel. The whispers faded instantly, replaced by a deep, rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, reverberating through the walls and the ground beneath my feet. The tunnel's floor was different this time, smoother and colder, as though it were carved from obsidian. The walls pulsed faintly with veins of dim red light, like blood coursing through an open wound. I moved forward, the key in my hand growing heavier with every step. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. Time lost meaning as I walked, my footsteps the only sound in the oppressive silence. The heartbeat grew louder, faster, until it matched the frantic pace of my own pulse. The key in my hand burned with cold fire, and I felt it pulling me towards something ahead, something waiting in the depths of the tunnel. Then I saw it. A door stood at the end of the passage, impossibly tall and covered in intricate carvings that shifted and writhed as I approached. It was made of a dark, almost liquid material, and the carvings depicted scenes that twisted my stomach, faces frozen in agony, hands reaching out in desperation, shadows devouring light. At the center of the door was a keyhole, its edges glowing faintly with the same red light as the walls. The key in my hand thrummed with energy, vibrating as though eager to complete its purpose. My steps slowed as I neared the door, dread settling over me like a suffocating shroud. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to insert the key, not to turn it, not to open whatever lay beyond. But the door was calling to me, just as the tunnel had, just as the key had. I raised the key, my hand trembling violently. The cold emanating from it had seeped into my bones, numbing my fingers as I slid it into the lock. The fit was perfect, as though the door had been waiting for this exact key, for this exact moment. The heartbeat stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. My breath hitched as I turned the key, the sound of the mechanism inside the door grinding painfully loud in the stillness. With a final, resounding click, the carvings on the door came to life, the writhing figures twisting and shifting as if trying to escape. The door swung open. Beyond it was nothingness, pure, unbroken void. It stretched out endlessly, a vast expanse of black that seemed to swallow the light from the tunnel behind me. But it wasn't empty. Far off in the distance, something moved. It was massive, its shape impossible to define, shifting and coiling like a storm made of shadows. The whispers returned, softer now, almost reverent. They filled my ears with words I couldn't understand, and yet I felt their meaning. This was it. This was the source, the beginning and the end, the thing that had called me here. The void began to pull at me, a gentle but irresistible force dragging me toward the edge. I tried to resist, planting my feet firmly on the ground, but it was no use. The pull grew stronger, and I felt my body tilt forward, the doorframe disappearing as the void consumed my vision. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the figure, the version of myself I'd left in the ash-covered field. It stood at the edge of the void, watching silently as I fell. Then everything went black. The blackness was complete, an oppressive void that pressed against me from all sides. I wasn't falling anymore, but I wasn't standing either. It felt as if I was suspended in nothingness, my body weightless and immaterial. Time lost all meaning. It could have been seconds or centuries before the first sound broke the silence. A whisper, soft and singular, cutting through the void like a needle through fabric. It wasn't the chaotic, layered cacophony from before. It was calm, measured, and familiar. It was my voice. "Do you understand now?" I tried to answer, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My own voice answered itself, echoing through the void, growing louder with each repetition. "Do you understand now? Do you understand now?" The phrase became a chorus, a rising tide of sound that vibrated through me until I thought I might shatter. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. And the void blinked. I can't explain it any better than that. It was as though the darkness itself had closed and reopened, revealing something vast and incomprehensible. The void was no longer empty. Shapes moved in the distance, enormous and shifting, their forms defying logic or reason. They twisted and folded in on themselves, each motion radiating a deep, thrumming sound that resonated in my bones. I felt small, infinitesimal beneath their gaze. Because they were gazing, I could feel it, a weight on my soul that burned and froze at the same time. They weren't eyes, not in the way we understand them, but they saw me all the same. They saw through me. Then came the first word, spoken in a language I didn't know but understood perfectly. Choose. A single word, but it carried the weight of eternity. The shifting forms began to move faster, circling me, their immense presence distorting the void into spirals of light and shadow. Images flashed in my mind, memories that weren't mine, lives that hadn't been lived. I saw roads stretching endlessly into the horizon, tunnels lined with keys that stretched far beyond what I'd explored. I saw reflections of myself, each one making a different choice, each one walking a different path. I understood then. This wasn't the end. It was another beginning, one of infinite possibilities. The door I'd opened hadn't led to a single truth or resolution. It had opened the way to something much larger, something that existed outside the boundaries of time and space. The choice was mine, but the stakes were unknowable. The entities moved closer, their forms coalescing into something more tangible but no less alien. One extended a limb, a tendril, a hand, a claw. It shifted with every heartbeat. At the end of it dangled another key. This one wasn't like the others I'd seen. It was blackened and jagged, its surface pulsing faintly as though alive. Its tag was blank, but the whispers in my mind filled the void where the name should have been. It wasn't my name, it was something older, something I couldn't pronounce. Another limb extended, holding a second key. This one was smooth and gleaming, its surface reflecting light that wasn't there. The tag bore no name, only a symbol, a circle within a circle, endlessly spiraling inward. The whispers around this key were softer, almost pleading, as if urging me toward it. The third figure didn't extend anything. It stood motionless, its presence suffocating. But in its shadow, I saw a door, another door, smaller than the one I'd just passed through, but radiating an energy that made my skin crawl. It had no keyhole. It waited, silent and ominous, its meaning clear. A refusal to choose was a choice of its own. The void shifted again, pressing against me, urging me forward. The entities pulsed in time with the whispers, their forms flickering like flames in a storm. Choose the word came again, louder this time, reverberating through the vast emptiness. My hand trembled as I reached out, the weight of infinite possibilities pressing down on me. I could feel the consequences radiating from each option, endless paths spiraling outward from this single moment. Whatever I chose, it wouldn't just affect me, it would ripple outward, touching everything, everyone, in ways I couldn't comprehend. I hesitated, my fingers hovering between the jagged key and the gleaming one. The whispers grew frantic, desperate, overlapping until they became a roar. And then I made my choice. The void collapsed around me instantly, folding in on itself with a deafening silence. The ground returned beneath my feet, solid and cold, and the air was filled with the sound of rushing wind. I stumbled forward, my vision swimming, and when I looked up, I was standing in front of my house. The street was quiet, the faint glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and my hands were empty. The key was gone. The tunnel was gone. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I'd escaped. But when I turned toward the door, I saw it. Hanging from the porch light, swaying gently in the breeze, was a single key. Its tag bore my name, and from inside the house I heard footsteps. They were uneven, dragging, and they were coming toward the door.